Okay, wow, you really weren't kidding about diving deep into work-life balance, huh?
Well, I figured we should really get into it, right?
Yeah, you weren't messing around. Articles, podcasts, even a YouTube video in here. Someone's been busy.
I might have gone a little overboard, but hey, that's what deep dives are for, right?
Right. So, where do we even start with all this? I mean, just looking at the stack makes me feel a little, well, unbalanced.
Haha, I get that. Actually, that's one thing that really jumped out at me too. A lot of these sources, they kind of push back on that whole idea of work-life balance right off the bat.
Yeah, I saw that too. BetterUp, they just straight up call it a myth.
Yeah.
I have to admit, even hearing that phrase makes me feel a little, I don't know, behind, like I'm already failing.
Yeah, no, totally. It's like that classic image of the scales, right?
Hmm.
Perfectly balanced, half work, half life.
Right, but who actually lives like that?
Exactly. And that's where this idea of integration comes in. Several sources mention that. It's more about like how work and life kind of flow together, not necessarily being perfectly equal all the time.
Okay, yeah, I see that. So less like a scale and more like, I don't know, a smoothie. Everything's blended together.
That's a great way to put it. It's about finding a rhythm where work and life can coexist, even complement each other,
Mm-hmm.
instead of always battling it out for your attention.
Oh, okay. That makes me feel a little less stressed already. But I gotta think it takes more than just changing how we think about it, right? There's gotta be more to it than just like wordplay.
You're absolutely right. It's not just semantics. Atlassian, they really emphasize this, the importance of mindset. They argue that approaching this whole thing with a sense of self-acceptance, well, it's crucial. Ditching that constant comparison game.
Ah, yes. Don't even get me started on social media. Everyone's life looks so perfect and balanced online.
Right. It's totally a recipe for feeling like you're not doing enough. Atlassian, they suggest embracing what they call a growth mindset instead. It's like, it's okay to mess up. Focus on learning and getting better, rather than striving for some impossible perfection.
So it's kind of like giving ourselves permission to be human, even when it comes to this whole work-life balancing act.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And speaking of being human, one of the Atlassian authors, he shares this really relatable story about how even though his team knew he was taking time off to be with his family, he still felt this pressure to check in with work.
Oh my gosh, that is so me. Like you're at your kid's soccer game, but in the back of your mind, you're drafting that email.
Yeah, exactly. It's tough to really disconnect. So how do we actually break free from that? That's the million-dollar question.
Right. Well, if these sources are any indication, the answer seems to be, well, boundaries, 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 boundaries.
Right. Almost every single source we have here mentions boundaries in some way. Like it's a non-negotiable.
Okay, but how do we actually make them work? I mean, I'm looking at Brian Tracy's advice here. Define specific work hours and stick to them. And it sounds great on paper, but
But in reality,
a little tougher, right?
yeah, it's like my inbox has a life of its own.
You're telling me it's especially challenging now in this crazy hyper-connected world where, like, everyone expects us to be available 24/7.
Right, always on.
Mm.
So what can we do about it?
Well, in that YouTube video we have, Brian Tracy, he actually suggests scheduling digital detox time.
Okay, so like intentionally disconnecting from our devices
Hmm.
for a set period of time.
Exactly. Give yourself permission to be unreachable, even if it's just for an hour or two.
That almost feels revolutionary these days.
Right. It's like reclaiming your time and attention. And it's not just about the digital stuff either. Impossible Psychological Services, they emphasize setting clear boundaries between work and personal life in general. This is especially important, they say, for people who might struggle with workaholism, where those lines get blurry. Right, you start answering emails at dinner, working on weekends, it all just bleeds together.
Exactly. So creating those clear demarcations, mental, physical, digital, it's really key to protecting your time and energy.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about when everything feels urgent? How do you prioritize when it feels like everything's a priority?
Yeah, that's the real struggle. That's where this impossible psychological services piece gets really interesting. They talk about this tool called the Eisenhower Matrix.
The Eisenhower Matrix. Okay, I'm officially intrigued. What's that all about?
So picture this. You've got a grid, right? 4 quadrants. And you categorize your tasks based on how urgent they are and how important they are. So things that are both urgent and important, like let's say a client presentation that's due tomorrow, well, that goes in the do it now quadrant.
Okay, that's your firefighting zone. Makes sense. But what about everything else? There's a lot more to life than just putting out fires.
Right. So tasks that are important but not urgent, like planning a family vacation, those would go in the schedule it quadrant.
Hmm.
You want to make time for these things, but you don't need to do them right this second. Then there's the stuff that's urgent but not important. Those are often things you can delegate maybe. Get someone else to help you out. And then finally, you've got the eliminate quadrant.
Okay, so those are the time wasters, right? The things we do out of habit or obligation, but don't actually contribute much.
Exactly. Get rid of them. Now, even with all this planning, all these boundaries, sometimes life just throws a curveball, right?
All right.
And that's where I think that idea of support comes in. You can't do it all alone.
You're so right. Both Momentum and BetterUp, they really emphasize that, building a support system. And it doesn't have to be like a formal thing, family, friends, coworkers, even like a therapist, if that's helpful for you. Having those people you can rely on that get it, that can offer encouragement, or just listen when you need to vent, well, it makes a huge difference. And it's not just about receiving support either, right? It's about being supportive to others, too. Being there for your friends, your family, your colleagues when they need it.
Exactly. It goes both ways. Momentum, they actually give some specific tips for building that support system too. Reaching out, being reciprocal, joining groups.
And being willing to ask for help when you need it.
Yes, exactly. And that all ties into the need for open communication too, both with your family and at work.
Okay, so we're talking about having those sometimes uncomfortable conversations about expectations, about needs, not just assuming we know what others want or need.
Right. It reminds me of that story in the BetterUp article about the parent who realized they were totally wrong about family dinners.
Oh, yeah. What was it? They were trying to make these elaborate meals every night, thinking that's what their family wanted.
Right. But it turned out what everyone really valued was just spending time together, even if it meant takeout sometimes.
Wow, that is so relatable. I think we all get caught up in trying to do everything perfectly. But sometimes the simplest solution is the best one.
Totally. So it's about communicating clearly, listening actively, and being willing to adjust our expectations. But that can be tricky at work, right? Sometimes it feels like you have zero control over your workload or your schedule. You're right, it can be tough. But, Atlassian had some interesting advice about that. They talk about being open with your colleagues about the challenges you're facing.
So fostering that culture of understanding and collaboration. But what about those moments when, even with all that effort, those boundaries we worked so hard to set, well, they get crossed. Like you get that urgent email at 9 p.m., or your boss asks you to work on a project over the weekend.
Ooh, yeah, those moments. That's a really great question, and it kind of leads us to another crucial aspect of this whole work-life integration thing that we need to explore, but I think that's a perfect place to pause for now.
You're right. We've covered a lot of ground already. We talked about that myth of balance, explored the importance of mindset and boundaries, even learned about the Eisenhower Matrix.
We did, and we talked about the power of support and open communication, but there's still more to unpack, for sure.
Definitely. So in the next part, we'll delve deeper into strategies for dealing with those boundary crossing moments. We'll talk about self-care. Can't forget about that.
Yeah.
And even look at ways to involve our families in this whole work-life integration journey.
Exactly. So until next time, everyone, remember to breathe, set those boundaries, and don't be afraid to ask for help. See you in part 2.
See you then.
Welcome back. It's really interesting digging into all these different strategies with you.
Totally. Before the break, we were talking about setting those boundaries, asking for support, all the things that help us protect our time and energy. But I gotta ask, what happens when those boundaries get crossed? Like, when that late night email pops up or your boss suddenly dumps the last minute project on you. How do you resist that pressure to always be on?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it kind of highlights that we need to be proactive, not just reactive, right? Remember that impossible psychological services piece? They talked about workaholism and how it can really sneak up on you, especially if you're like a people pleaser or you have a hard time saying no.
Oh, yeah, totally. It's so easy to get caught up in trying to meet everyone else's needs. You completely forget about your own.
Exactly. And that's why I think what Brian Tracy was saying about aligning your career with your personal values is so important. When you're really clear on what matters most to you, it makes it easier to make those tough decisions, even when it means saying no to something that seems urgent or important in the moment.
Right. So it's about taking a step back and asking, okay, does this really align with my goals, with my values? And if not, maybe it's time to politely decline or, maybe negotiate a different approach.
Exactly. And that negotiation piece, it can involve advocating for yourself,
Sure.
maybe requesting a more reasonable deadline, or even suggesting different solutions. It's about being assertive, but not aggressive. Framing your request in a way that benefits both you and the team.
Right. It's a win-win. So we're being proactive, we're setting those boundaries, communicating clearly, making sure our actions line up with our values. But even with all that, I mean, let's be real. Sometimes work is just going to spill over into our personal lives.
Hmm.
And that's where those support systems we talked about earlier become really important, right?
Absolutely. Having those people you can vent to, brainstorm with, or just, get a hug from when you're feeling completely overwhelmed,
Hmm.
well, that can be a lifesaver. Momentum, they really emphasize that. The importance of having a network of people who get it. Could be family, friends, colleagues, or even a therapist, whoever you feel comfortable talking to.
Yeah, and it's not just about having those people to lean on when things are rough either. It's about celebrating the wins together, sharing the joys, creating those moments of connection that make life feel a little more balanced and fulfilling, right?
So true. And you know what? That reminds me of something we saw in a few of these sources, this idea of actually involving your family in your work life.
Wait, really? That kind of sounds counterintuitive, right? Aren't we trying to create more separation between work and family?
I know, right? But hear me out. Momentum, they suggest that sharing your work experiences with your kids in an age-appropriate way, of course, it can actually help them understand what you do and even model some important life skills.
Okay, that's interesting. Tell me more about that.
Well, they give some really cool examples, like
Hmm.
telling stories about your day, the challenges you faced, how you overcame them. It's a way to uh, model resilience, problem solving, and even a little bit of humor when things don't go exactly according to plan.
Right. It's like you're demystifying work, showing them that it's not this like separate, stressful thing that takes you away from them all the time.
Exactly. And they suggest things like take your child to work day, if your workplace allows that.
Hmm.
Or for younger kids, using analogies, comparing your job to something they understand, like building a Lego tower or baking a cake.
Oh, I love that. Making it relatable, even engaging for them. That's so smart. But what about our partners? How do we make sure we're, nurturing that relationship in the midst of all this work-life integration stuff?
Well, the Balancing Act podcast, they had some really good advice about that. They really emphasized the importance of carving out dedicated couple time, even if it's just, 30 minutes after the kids go to bed.
Right. So like date nights or even just those little moments of connection throughout the day.
Exactly. It doesn't have to be fancy or elaborate. It's really about being present with each other, listening, showing appreciation for those little things,
Right.
remembering that you're a team, not just two ships passing in the night.
That's so true. It's so easy to let that connection fade when you're both stressed and exhausted. But those small gestures, they really do make a huge difference in keeping that bond strong. But, sometimes I wonder if we're putting too much pressure on ourselves to find this like perfect balance. Like maybe it's more about accepting that it's going to be messy sometimes, that some days are just going to be better than others.
You're so right. It's a journey, not a destination. And sometimes it really is about letting go of that need to control everything and embracing the ebb and flow of life.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's where self-care comes in, right? We can't pour from an empty cup. If we're not taking care of ourselves, both physically and mentally, it's going to be a lot harder to show up as our best selves for work and family.
Totally. Remember that section in the Momentum article about prioritizing self-care? They talk about all the basics, getting enough sleep, eating well, exercising,
Yeah.
all the things we know are good for us, but are so easy to let slide when we're busy.
Ah, yes. Those are always the first things to go.
Right. But they also talk about the mental and emotional aspects of self-care too. Practicing mindfulness, spending time in nature, pursuing hobbies, connecting with loved ones. Activities that nourish your soul, the things that bring you joy.
It's about finding what fills your cup and making it a non-negotiable part of your routine.
Exactly. And remember, self-care is not selfish. It's an act of self-preservation. It allows you to show up more fully for everyone else in your life.
And sometimes, self-care might even mean seeking professional help. There's
Yeah.
no shame in that, right? Reaching out to a therapist or counselor if you're struggling to manage stress, anxiety, or other mental health challenges.
Absolutely. It's actually a sign of strength, not weakness, to acknowledge when you need support.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we've talked about setting those boundaries, aligning our actions with our values, building that support system, prioritizing self-care. Is there anything else?
Well, one thing that really struck me as we were going through these sources is how many of them talk about flexibility and adaptability.
That makes sense. I mean, life is unpredictable, right? Things rarely go exactly according to plan.
Exactly. So instead of getting frustrated or giving up when things don't go our way, it's about learning to roll with the punches. you know, adjusting our expectations.
So instead of trying to control every single aspect of our lives, it's more about finding a sense of flow and accepting that, hey, sometimes things are just going to be messy and imperfect.
Yes. And that acceptance can actually be incredibly freeing. It allows us to let go of the pressure to do everything perfectly and focus on what really matters.
I love that. But honestly, even with all these great strategies, it's still easy to feel kind of overwhelmed. Like, where do you even begin to put all this into practice? That's a great question. And
Yeah.
it brings up a really important point that several of our sources actually touched on.
You were saying how some of the sources touched on an important point about putting all these strategies into practice. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. A lot of the sources emphasize that this whole work-life integration thing, well, it's not just about individual effort, It's also about the systems, the structures we're operating within.
Oh, okay. So it's not just about us trying to be like superhuman jugglers. It's also about the environment we're juggling in.
Exactly. I mean, think about it. If your workplace culture is one where everyone's expected to be available 24/7, or if you don't have access to affordable childcare, well, it's going to be a lot harder to find that harmony no matter how many personal strategies you try to implement.
Right. It's like trying to run a marathon in flip-flops. You might be a great runner, but your equipment's holding you back.
That's a great analogy. And a few of our sources actually talk about that. Remember BetterUp, how they emphasized a supportive work environment? They talk about how important it is for employers to really foster a culture that values work-life integration, not just, talk about it, but actually walk the walk.
Yeah. Things like flexible work arrangements, paid parental leave,
Hmm.
even just managers modeling healthy boundaries themselves. All those things can make a real difference in people's lives.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the policies either, right? It's about the overall attitudes, the behaviors, creating an environment where people actually feel comfortable taking breaks, setting limits, prioritizing their well-being without feeling judged or, penalized for it.
Right. It's a total mindset shift from work comes first no matter what to, hey, we're all human beings here with lives outside of work.
Exactly. And, impossible psychological services, they touch on this too. The importance of advocating for systemic change, pushing for policies that support working families, challenging those outdated norms, raising awareness about issues like workaholism and burnout.
So it's about using our voices, our choices, to create a more supportive and sustainable work culture for everyone.
Yeah, it's recognizing that this isn't just an individual problem, it's a collective one,
Mm,
and that we can all do our part to make things better.
I love that. We're all in this together, figuring it out as we go.
We are. And, as we're wrapping up this deep dive, I'm really struck by just how many different perspectives, how
Hmm.
many different approaches there are to this whole work-life integration thing. There's no one right answer, is there?
Not at all. What works for one person might not work for another. And that's okay. It's about finding what works for you, for your family, for your own unique circumstances.
Exactly. And being patient with yourself, experimenting, giving yourself permission to adjust things as you go.
And remembering that it's a journey, not a destination, right?
Yes. There will be good days, bad days, times when you feel like you're rocking it, and times when you feel like you're failing miserably.
But hey, that's life, right? The important thing is to keep learning, keep growing, keep striving to find that harmony, whatever that looks like for you.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Now, before we sign off, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. Remember how we talked about that whole myth of balance earlier? Well, what if, instead of chasing this perfect balance, what if we focused on intention?
Intention. I like that. Tell me more.
What if, in each moment, we just paused and asked ourselves, okay, where do I want to be most present right now?
Wow. Yeah, that's powerful. So instead of trying to split ourselves in half all the time, it's about being fully present wherever we are, whether that's at work, at home, or somewhere in between.
Exactly. It's about making those conscious choices, about where we direct our energy, our attention, based on what truly matters most to us in that moment.
I really love that shift in perspective. It's not about achieving this perfect balance. It's about aligning our actions with our intentions.
You got it. And I think that's a really empowering message to leave our listeners with. You have the power to choose where you want to be present, how you want to spend your time, what kind of life you want to create.
That's a fantastic note to end on. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive. It's been a really insightful journey, and I hope our listeners found it helpful as they navigate their own work-life integration journeys too.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, everyone, you're doing great. Keep experimenting, keep learning, and keep being awesome.
Thanks for listening, everyone.